Japan has removed Korea off its white list of trusted partners earlier this month, and the revised export control took effect as of today. More than 1,000 strategic items are now subject to an individual export approval from Japan, which could take up to 90 days. Korea had made numerous requests for dialogue while hinting that it would reconsider the fate of GSOMIA should Japan roll back its export curbs. But ignoring those gestures, Japan has downgraded Korea's trade status. Today, we go in depth on the whitelist removal of Korea and the possible fallout with Dr. Jun-sok, professor of economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Welcome to the program.
Happy to be here.
So Korea's trade status has been officially downgraded by Japan, but market reactions were relatively calm today. Let's begin with the market reactions.
Okay, well, the market day today was okay. It wasn't a great day, but then it wasn't a bad day either, so I guess that counts as a plus. The KOSPI went up by 0.86%. Kosdaq actually had a fairly good day. It went up by 2.48%, but that's coming off a very bad week they had last week. But still, the fact that Kosdaq rose so much makes today a relatively good day. And then won weakened by about 0.22%. So while there were a lot of people who expected a lot of problems today because today was the actual day that Japan implemented its policies, it actually turned out to be a fairly quiet day, partially I think because people expected this event, so they calculated it, baked it into the stock market price from a few weeks ago. And then Japan did not place additional goods on the controlled list. We are right now off the white list, but Japan had the option of putting some more goods on the controlled list where Koreans had to, when they want to import something from Japan, the Japanese firm would have to seek Japanese approval for every time that they would need to export. They did not put any additional goods on the list other than the three chemicals that were there before, the etching gas, fluoride, proamide, and the photoresist. And then there was the MSCI Emerging Market Fund rebalancing event. The MSCI EM Fund were expected to sell a lot of Korean stocks at the end of last week, and they did sell a lot of stocks, but because they were bought up very quickly, it did not have as much effect on the stock market as people feared, and I think that placed into a general optimism on the stock market, so we had an okay day today.
Although Japan did not specify the items that would face tougher trade restrictions, trade controls, but still, more than 1,000 strategic items are now exposed. They may face tougher export controls, meaning they could face the individual case-by-case export approval from Japan, which would cause great damage in the Korean firm's material supplies. What kind of items are included in that among the 1,000 strategic items?
Okay, well, the items that Korean companies are very much afraid of is other types of chemicals that are used in the production process. Japan is very strong on chemicals, and a lot of Korean firms use various types of chemicals in their production process. And some of it, it's very difficult to get outside of Japan. Some of it, if you get it outside of Japan, it costs a lot more. So chemicals are definitely one of the areas. And then you have carbon fibers and parts for batteries, which include solar batteries and hydrogen batteries. Because Korea wants to develop the hydrogen power automobiles as well as hydrogen power cells, these batteries are crucial, and some of the parts that you need for these batteries are only available from Japan, or if we get it from elsewhere, then the costs rise up considerably. Now, another area that we are very much afraid of is manufacturing machinery. Japan produces a lot of manufacturing equipment that are used by Korea to make other machinery. And a lot of those equipment is only available from Japan, or again, if we get it from someplace else like Germany, it'll cost significantly more. And because Korean companies would have to adapt these other equipment into their production process, it'll very large costs involved. So those are some of the areas where we are very much afraid of. And then going back to semiconductors, Japan has a very large semiconductor wafer export market, export firms. So if we cannot get wafers, since those are the basic blocks of building semiconductors, if you can't get wafers from Japan, that'll cause a lot of problems in the semiconductor industry, perhaps even more than the 3 chemicals that we already have some problems with.
That doesn't sound good at all. Now, there are reports that Korea could utilize the Internal Compliance Program, or ICP, of some Japanese firms, which would allow Korean firms to enjoy the benefits they used to enjoy previously before being removed off Japan's whitelist. Can you tell us more about this program?
Okay, it's a bit complex, but basically now, in principle, every time a Japanese company wants to export controlled products, they have to seek Japanese approval. Now, previously, Japan had a blanket approval for countries that are on the whitelist, and because Korea was on the whitelist, it didn't have to seek any approval at all. But now, at least in principle, every time Korea wants to import a controlled product from Japan, that Japanese firm has to file an approval, get an approval from Japanese government. But if they are complying with the CP program, compliance program, then these Japanese companies don't have to get individual approval from the Japanese government unless Japanese government specifies on a specific list that they have to get approval for these items, even for companies which have CP approval. But so far, the only 3 items that Japanese government have put on that individual product list is the 3 chemicals that deals with the semiconductors. So for everything else, if you're purchasing from a Japanese company which has the CP approval, then it doesn't really change much at all. You can still get the product fairly quickly, and you don't have to file that many more paperwork. What is a problem is that there's about 1,300 Japanese companies which have the CP approval from the Japanese government. And for Korean companies which do not import from these CP-approved companies, they have to, these Japanese companies, when they're exporting to Korea, they have to seek approval from the Japanese government. That takes a lot of paperwork, and that also takes about 3 months to get approval. So for Korean companies, which are usually small and medium-sized companies who have to get items from the non-CP approved Japanese companies, for them it'll be a significant increase in time and cost involved in getting these goods from Japan.
There are also reports on how Japanese firms are looking for the loopholes, seeking ways to export materials to South Korean firms through a third country. How do you see this? And does this imply that Japanese firms will also be badly hurt by those trade restrictions against South Korea?
Okay, for some of the companies, we can use the 3 semiconductor chemicals as examples. For some of the Japanese companies which supply these chemicals, they're large chemical companies, and the etching gas or the photoresist is only part of what they make. And in the production process for semiconductors, they actually don't need that much. For those companies, they can weather the reduction of revenues that come from export controls to Korea. But for some smaller companies that may be very specialized in certain chemicals or certain products, if they have to seek approval from the Japanese government, and if Japanese government has the option to cut exports completely, then it could mean a major loss for these companies. So for these smaller companies who only specialize in 1 or 2 products, they may seek to produce these items outside Japan, outside the range of their export controls, and that's what seems to be happening. So it's either some smaller companies which are seeking to remove some of their production outside Japan, or it's some of the larger companies, but where their trade with Korea, trade with Samsung or other major companies are so important to their company that they cannot afford to lose Samsung or SK as a customer. So in those cases, we are seeing some companies move, but I'm not sure if you'll see a lot of them because, well, Japan is painting this as a national security issue, and obviously, if you're trying to contravene the restrictions based on national security, well, the government and the Japanese people will not look kindly on these Japanese companies.
Now, you've mentioned that you've listed quite a few areas that the Korean firms are most afraid of, but of the more than 1,000 strategic items that are now subject to tougher export regulations from Japan, which items do you think Japan will target next?
Okay, well, I think the key is that, first of all, their goal is to bring Korea to the negotiation table on the Japanese reparation issue. So they're not actually seeking to just destroy Korean economy. So I don't think they'll use a massive retaliation, but they will do it very strategically. Now, the key to the strategy involved is actually simple enough. It causes a lot of damage to Korea or a lot of political problems for Korea, but it does not cause many problems for Japan in terms of economics or politics. Now, the items that are coming up is, as I mentioned before, carbon fiber, battery-related equipment, because, well, those you can export to a lot of places other than Korea, and those are crucial for hydrogen power automobiles and batteries that Korea is gung-ho about, especially for the Moon administration, which has targeted hydrogen-powered cars as one of the brightest future industries that Korea can get into. And then the display semiconductors, the LED, OLED type of chips. The Chinese competitors are coming very close to the level of Korea. So if Japan restricts some of the chemicals that are needed to make these display semiconductors, that could give quite an edge to Chinese companies. That creates a sort of a desperation in the Korean companies. So I think those type of goods will be targeted. Now, Korean Economic Research Institute had a very interesting survey that was carried out just a few days ago. They tried to see which industries would be hurt the most by Japanese trade restrictions. And actually, the number one industry turned out to be machinery industry, because as I said before, Korean machinery companies depend on Japanese companies to supply them with manufacturing equipment. So if you wanted to really hurt a lot of Korean companies, that might be the area that Japan might want to target. But for the most part, the equipment manufacturers in Japan, I think, are very dependent on Korean customers. So it'll cause a lot of damage to the Japanese companies as well as the Korean companies. And I don't think the Japanese government wants to hurt their own companies all that much. So even though it may cause most damage in Korea, I'm not sure they would go for it. So carbon fibers, battery-related equipment, semiconductor-related equipment, I think are the best targets in terms of Japan.
And one last question for you. The Korean government announced today it'll invest more than $4 billion in the local parts, materials, and equipment sectors over the next 3 years as part of efforts to mitigate the fallout. Could this be a viable solution?
I'm sorry to say, at least with the measures that we have so far, no. And that's because there's too much being concentrated only on the R&D side. Now, R&D is not something definite. Just because you give them a lot of money, that does not mean you'll come up with a good in a fixed period of time. R&D by its nature, if you get lucky, you get it quickly. If you're unlucky, it could take years or decades to get the product. But even more than that, we had these type of R&D development programs before. And where Korea always had problems was commercializing these developments from R&D. We had problems with startup companies. Startup companies tend to have a very bright, short careers, but then it falls down because, well, their profitability does not last long. The larger companies steal their intellectual property and so on. So one problem is commercialization. The other problem is that even if you wanted to set up these industries, there are a lot of legal and regulatory barriers. We recognize that there's some problems here for quite a while, but we haven't really been able to fix the problem. And then there's problems with interest groups. When you're coming up with new goods that could replace older goods, you always have some conflict between the existing interest groups. And we haven't really learned how to solve the problem of conflict between the interest groups. Not only people who are getting replaced, but also environmental groups, also people who, when you're building a factory, people who live around the neighborhoods whose property values can go down and they may face dangers from changes in the environment, pollution. So unless we come up with a very wide-ranging structural reforms that deal with all these issues, just throwing money in R&D, I don't think, well, I will never say that Korea I will always say that Korea needs more R&D expenditure, but it's not enough. We have to go through all these structural reforms if you are really serious about developing these products in Korea.
All right. Thank you, Professor Young, for your perspectives.
Thank you.
And that wraps up our show. From all of us here at Arirang, thank you for watching.